So now, Chris McEntee from Moon Studios, lead designer, will tell us about crafting the world of Ori and Will of the Wisps. So, Chris, you are welcome.
Okay, thanks a lot, Vlad. Okay, so hi everyone. As he said, my name is Chris, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about how we crafted the world of the game Ori and the Will of the Wisps. So a little bit of background on myself, just to get started. I am a game and level designer. That's sort of how I got my start in the industry, pretty much in what I've been doing for the past 10 years. I worked for a number of years at Ubisoft on the Rayman franchise. So as a level designer and game designer on Rayman Origins and Rayman Legends. And then I was basically recruited by Moon Studios about 5 years ago to sort of work as a level designer and support on the production of Ori and the Will of the Wisps, pretty much. While I was hired as a level designer, primarily at the very start, due to my experience on artistic 2D platformers like the Rayman series, very quickly my role kind of expanded on the project, and I ended up touching on pretty much every aspect of design and even some sort of topics outside of design from time to time. And ultimately, that's why I was in the role of lead designer by the end of my time on the project. But some of the topics I touched on were, for example, game design and prototyping, along with obviously level design, which is what I was hired to do originally. I also ended up working on some UI design. I was integrated into the story team, so I touched a lot on the story development and especially the narrative design and how the narrative got integrated into sort of the game experience itself. And also things like combat and boss design, among other responsibilities. But the reason I want to mention this at the very start is because I think that the insight that I gained through having this sort of bird's eye view of the project from a number of different aspects really helped to inform the sort of construction of the world and the environments of Ori and the Will of the Wisps as sort of this homogeneous whole that really brings together all of the necessary elements of combat and story and level design and challenge and exploration and all these things. So ultimately, that's my responsibilities were kind of spread among those different areas, but I definitely spent a lot of my time, if not most of it, for a majority of the project, really on level design more than anything else. So a little bit about Ori and the Will of the Wisps itself. It is a sequel to Ori and the Blind Forest, Moon Studios' first title, which was critically acclaimed. So they decided to make a second one. It is a 2D platformer, just like the first one, and it's what's considered a metroidvania. I assume that many of you are familiar with what a metroidvania is, but I will explain a little bit of more about that in some detail in a future slide. And the game was also critically acclaimed like its predecessor, which we were very happy about after all the time we spent working on it. Obviously, making a sequel to a game, especially a critically acclaimed one, is no trivial feat, pretty much. We really wanted to sort of go big with a sequel and not just basically deliver the same experience, but just in a new world or something. We didn't want it to be too similar to the first game. We wanted it to really stand on its own and feel like a real evolution from the original. And so one of the very first intentions that we had early on in the project was sort of going a bit more open in terms of the world structure and how the player can explore and traverse the spaces that we were crafting. Because in the very first game, while the world is still a Metroidvania world, and again, I'll explain a bit more in detail what that entails, but it's not a flat level where you just go from point A to point B. You're kind of progressing back and forth all over the map, getting from places to place for the story and for other reasons. But the order in which you did those events was linear in the first game for all intents and purposes. You had to go to level A before going to level B, before going to level C. And we kind of wanted to break that structure a little bit and give the player a little bit more openness to the way that they want to approach traversing this world that we'd crafted. That had some implications on the story that we were able to tell, how we were going to tell it and things like this. But ultimately, we were able to sort of realize this vision for a significant portion of the experience. We also wanted to have a larger game world. I mean, this pretty much goes without saying, but usually when you make a sequel, you kind of want to go bigger than the original because you don't want people to look at it and think, that we sort of, reduced scope, if anything, or we just kind of sort of stayed stale with the same size, like people expect more, and we wanted to be able to deliver more with a larger team as well. We also wanted to have more diverse biomes, like more visual diversity and thematic diversity in the environments that the player is exploring throughout the game. In the first game, it was very much a forest environment that had a number of different, iconic and colorful different environments to explore, but they were ultimately all sort of, for the most part, very foresty themed, like swamps and bayous and treetops and things like this. And we really and glades, and we really wanted in the second game to sort of break away from that and still have very natural environments and still have a number of sort of forested environments. But we also wanted to be able to expand outward and have things that were a lot more, let's say, striking, like, frozen wastes and sandy deserts and all of these kinds, and like an underground sort of insect infested, dark and environment. We really wanted it to feel a little bit more diverse and a little bit more iconic and stand out than the first game. And then one other element that we kind of wanted to throw into the mix to sort of further change up the sequel from the original game was wanted to add a sort of a hub village to the game that the players can sort of come back to throughout the experience as they're exploring the world and sort of grow it through, investing in it, but also their traversal, in the environment grows outward as they unlock new abilities and things like this. So we definitely had like a lot of, lofty intentions with regards to the world and the levels that we were building on this game. And so I just kind of want to talk a little bit about, what that process looked like for building the world, and then in a little more of a granular way, like on a level perspective. So for the game world of Ori and the Will of the Wisps, I mentioned this earlier in one of the previous slides, but we have a sort of what's called like a metroidvania world structure. Metroidvania obviously comes from the game Metroid and also the game Castlevania, because they were the two games that sort of pioneered this sort of non-linear structure of constructing their worlds. But just to sort of give you contrast, I'm going to start with what traditional platforming games tend to have with regards to what they would consider a world structure, pretty much, and then describe how Metroidvania differs from that. So if you look at this example from Donkey Kong Country Returns, this is sort of like what you would expect from a very old school, traditional, level-based 2D platformer. Things like Mario, or even things more recent games like Shovel Knight, they have these sort of series of independent standalone level experiences that are connected to each other with certain paths. The player tends to have paths that they can choose some choice in which path they take in their pursuit of getting from the beginning of the world to the final level in the world. There are even some optional levels in there, but ultimately each world is its own self-contained series of levels, and each of those levels is its own self-contained experience, where the player simply goes from the start to the end. Usually you're not able to even backtrack to the beginning of the level because it's the way the levels are designed, they don't facilitate that, and they don't need to for the type of game that it is. And then basically once you've reached the end of a world, then you move on to World 3, World 4, World 5, and explore those new levels, all independent of one another. What Metroidvania does that's different is that it's actually one giant interconnected world. All of the levels are actually connected up to each other in various ways. And when you look at it as a whole, it looks like a very daunting, like, well, how do you even understand like which part is distinct from another and where are the levels actually? But when you break it down, you can actually see that, for example, the orange chunk is the very first level of the game, which is larger than maybe like a level traditionally would be in a traditional platformer. I would probably consider these almost like worlds to themselves that are then connected in the larger world. But for the sake of semantics, we call them areas pretty much. So the first area of the game is this orange one, and then eventually you make your way to the green area, which is the second world of the game. And then you're able to go to the third one, which is the pink one, and then the yellow one. So there is some sort of structure to this. The player is still going from sort of, let's say, area 1 to area 2 to area 3 in the overall sort of narrative progression of the game. But it's not these sort of self-contained isolated spaces. They connect to each other. The progression is sort of controlled by the way that the player sort of grows and obtains new abilities and things like this. So if they want to get into the second area of the game or the third area, they're going to need to unlock abilities along the way that allow them to do so. So this is sort of how Metroidvania games work in a nutshell, pretty much how their worlds are structured. And then it becomes a bit sort of complicated as a question, like, okay, well, you have this giant world that's composed of multiple areas that are sort of independent from one another in terms of mechanics and biomes and art and styling and all this kind of stuff. But they also have to connect to one another in a way that works for a lot of different considerations, pretty much. So as you can see with just this quick example, there were a number of different iterations sort of on this high level concept phase of how we were going to connect up the different spaces, the different areas of the game, pretty much. You can see, for example, that there's this frozen mountain pretty much over here. And then in the next iteration, as we were discussing things, it ended up on the complete opposite side of the world. And there were a number of different changes and shifts and swaps that we did for these spaces throughout the experience for numerous reasons. One of them being, for example, the story, of course. We knew that we wanted to tell a story, a deep, meaningful, emotional story, like the first game. And that has a very, very heavy impact on the way that the world is laid out and connected to itself, because we had to understand where the player is going to start, how they're going to progress outward from there, where they're going to get their abilities that are going to enable them to go from story point to story point that then guides the experience, narratively speaking. And so sometimes we realized, oh, now we need this temple to be in the desert environment. And so we actually have to change the way that this is connected. Or, oh, actually, for story purposes, we want the player to cross through the desert on their way to the final dungeon. And now we have to sort of make sure that those two are connected in some way. Or, oh, actually, now we don't want that connection to be between these levels, but from other levels. And we start shifting things around to fit the narrative intention that we had. So that's one consideration of numerous, for example, flow and progression. We had to understand, okay, well, how is the player going to progress through the world, unlock their abilities, what abilities are going to enable the player to enter certain which areas, and how are we going to put them, relative to each other so that the player easily discovers these new places that they can go to once they've, unlocked the abilities that enable it, right? And just how do we facilitate comfortable, interesting, and fun flow through these spaces as the player, traverses and then retraverses through the same environments on their way, going from one side of the world to the other for the next story moment or for a collectible they missed. We need to make sure that these environments flow well from level to level and from area to area, so that way the player doesn't feel like it's a tedious slog to be constantly doing this. And then also we considered things like logic and realism as well, which might seem a bit silly for a fantasy game, but it's a very artistic game. And, we wanted the world to feel, while even though it's fantastical, and even if not everything makes logical sense, we wanted to try as much as possible to inject a little bit of that believability to it. And so as you can see in all of these iterations of the world layout, and these are just a handful, we did many more in the process to land where we actually finally landed in the released game. You can see that Frosty Peak is always near the top of the world, right? It's never near the bottom. And that's because we wanted the player to feel like when they get to the top of this Frosty Peak, that it's one of the highest points in the world, pretty much, because logically speaking, that's what you would expect from it. And for example, near the very bottom is where you get this dark insect-infested cave environment where you can barely see, and it's all overgrown with fungus and things like this. And again, it just always made logical sense for that to be positioned in that location. And so we always took that into consideration. And then we had to adjust the other environments to sort of follow suit. Or for example, we always knew that we wanted the starter areas. So for example, you can see this swamp here and this giant code section. These were the first two areas in the game. And you can see that in all these iterations, they pretty much remained at the center, at the heart of the world. And that's because we wanted the general progression for the player to be expanding outward from those starting areas, and not necessarily that they're starting on one end of the world and then making their way further and further away from it. Again, on the sort of world design side, something we also wanted to do to try to get this sense of, connectedness and believability and consistency in the world was sort of create landmarks in the environment, like visual landmarks that actually tie in to physical environments that you will be able to explore later in the game. So in this example, you have this giant watermill structure in the background that's teased from a very, very early point in the game experience. And then hours later, the player actually finds themselves in the pursuit of following the main storyline they actually are standing right in front of this giant structure. They've reached it in physical space, and now they're able to enter it and explore it. And that feeling of having been able to, cover that wide distance, and whenever they come through this environment again and see the mill so far away and knowing that they've been there, that creates this really interesting sense of place that wouldn't be there otherwise. Because basically what we're trying to do is somewhat mask the fact that the world is literally just flat. That really, in reality, that mill is not in depth that way. It's all the way on the other side of the world. But we give the impression that you've actually traversed this distance and that the world is more three-dimensional than it actually is. And we did this same trick in the desert environment, Windswept Wastes, as well, with a giant sort of tower dungeon, and then you eventually reach the entrance as you progress through the environment. And we even did this with a very important landmark for the story, the sort of spirit tree, this giant split tree that you see in the prologue. And then throughout the experience, we tease you the same tree, the same landmark in a number of different contexts that sort of remind you that there's this giant sort of monument at the heart of the world. And at the very end, you eventually reach that spirit tree in the same plane, and you feel like this massive structure that you've been teased with all along, and you finally made it at the end of your journey, pretty much. And so again, these landmarks just really help to ground the world and make it feel like this connected, believable space that's more than just a flat platforming environment. So one principle of the sort of Metroidvania genre of game, pretty much, is basically gating progression in this big interconnected world until you get certain abilities that allow you to unblock the gates, pretty much. A gate can be something as simple as, you have a jump you have to make, but your single jump isn't high enough to reach, but then you get a double jump and suddenly you can reach a higher platform. And that in itself is a very natural gate that gets used a lot of the time. But in these sort of traditional Metroidvania games, there tends to be a habit of creating more gamey gates, where you literally have a blue door that uses a special ability to open, or a red door that needs another ability, or in the case of Guacamelee, various colored blocks that literally just require a different move to be able to break them, right? But for our game, we're so focused on visuals and story and believability of the world and in getting you immersed in the spaces, we wanted to stray away from that sort of gamey gating as much as possible. We still have it in a number of places. We try to mask those gates as something a little bit more integrated into the world and less just sort of in-your-face gamey. But especially for the key environments, like going from area to area, we really wanted to make sure that those gates were actually super memorable. So for example, the gate to the Moldwood Depths, this sort of spidery underground fungus environment, our artists made this very, evocative, interesting, mysterious gate visual, basically, that sort of is a horizontal door that opens up to allow us to descend into the depths, pretty much. It teases that you're going to be able to go down, which is, interesting because you're going to one of the deepest, darkest, lowest points in the entire game world. It teases that there's going to be this sort of insect, and maybe some kind of big spider in there. And basically, the player can discover this early on in the game and have this very strange feeling of like, what is this place? Will I be able to explore more here? And then later on, when they finally they come back, it opens up and they're able to descend. It feels more special. It feels like this sort of part of the world, pretty much. And it also sticks in the player's mind a lot more than just a simple colored block potentially would, because it's very iconic and different. It's one of a kind. It's not one of thousands of the same kind of gate that you find in the world. And another example, my favorite example personally from Ori and the Will of the Wisps, is this giant sleeping bear called Bar. That's pretty much the gate that's blocking your ability to get to sort of the frozen mountainous environment of the game. And you need to come back. You can find him very, very early in the experience. And you'll start hearing this big snoring sound as you approach. You'll enter this cave, and then you'll be greeted by this giant bear who's hibernating and blocking the path forward. And the player has no means to actually move this bear or get past them at this point in the game. And that's what's so, again, evocative and strange and mysterious and everything else. But also it feels grounded in this world, that it makes sense that there'd be this sort of big, animalistic creature in this environment, and he's just naturally blocking the gate, not because of a gamey consideration, but just because that's where he ended up sleeping, in this cave, pretty much. And then later in the game, the player comes back with the ability to flap a feather that then tickles his nose and he sneezes and opens the gate unintentionally. But that sense of discovery, you know, early on, we noticed it in some previews from the press, and they mentioned this thing that I really appreciated, where it said that Moon Studios reimagines these ordinary hurdles, things like gating, right, in a metroidvania, as something extraordinary. And I think that that really does summarize what we were trying to do as much as possible with these memorable gates in the game world to really make the game stand out. So those were some of the high-level world considerations, you know, like how we sort of constructed the place based on the individual levels and stuff. But now I want to sort of talk a little bit more on a lower level, a more granular level, about some of the level design itself considerations that sort of factor into how we were crafting this overall play space. So the world is made up of these sort of non-linear interconnected levels, pretty much. The player is not just simply going from point A to point B to point C in a linear fashion. They're not just going horizontally through the environment. They're actually exploring naturally and stumbling upon paths that they can tackle, or paths that they're blocked by with those gates, and then they have to circle back later on. So I wanted to give you just an example from the very beginning of Ori and the Will of the Wisps. So this is the starting area of the game, pretty much. The player starts at number 1 after the prologue is finished. And as they explore to the right, they eventually stumble upon a gate, stopping them from progressing to the right into this sort of orange level. So they have to go down and explore. And as they keep going down and zigzagging through, they eventually want to go right again, but they're blocked by another gate. So they have to then go left and explore to point number 2. And this is an important thing for us to kind of introduce to the player early on in a game like this, is that you're not constantly just going from left to right like a traditional platformer. You will have to circle back. You will have to go in all kinds of directions in the pursuit of finding out, you know, finding the path forward, pretty much. So as the player continues to point number 2, they eventually find a key that unlocks the door that stopped them from progressing right when they got to the bottom at the very beginning over here. And so now their goal is to go from point 2 to this gate and open it with the key that they got and then progress forward. And what you can see here is that we actually didn't want the player to just go straight back down and trace their steps all over again to get back. This is a trick that we use very often in the level design, where we create these loops, basically, that facilitate backtracking in a way that's comfortable for the player, and that doesn't make them have to just constantly do, you know, literal U-turns and backs and forths all the time. And obviously there are times where the player does retraverse through a space one for one, but sometimes going through the space backwards feels different from going through it forwards. So that in itself feels interesting to an extent. So as the player progresses to point number 3, there's an event that happens that allows them to now traverse down here to point number 4, which then gives them an ability, their first ability, which is a sword that lets them break, you know, breakable gates pretty much. That then enables them to explore further down and down and down to point number 5, which is the double jump. And then finally, once they've gotten the double jump, they're able to, little by little, make their way back up to point number 9. They have to make some stops along the way at points 6, 7, and 8 to get keys that unlock a door here that then enables them to zigzag through this space in a different path than when they originally came down. But then eventually they retrace their steps and climb back up, and they're able to get to point number 9 and continue the story forward. And the fun thing I like with this is that you can see the distance from 1 and 9 is kind of trivial, you know, but to get from point 1 to point 9, they have to do all of this kind of exploration and unlocking abilities and things. And that's sort of the general like principle of Metroidvania level design in a nutshell. But then layered on top of this, obviously, is we don't just care about the golden path. We're always considering, well, what can the player do on top of the golden path? What can they find alongside it if they're exploring, if they're curious and everything else? And so we place a number of side paths and optional content for the player to discover if they're looking out for it and if they're, you know, observant enough or skilled enough to overcome an optional challenge. So these are all of the optional side paths in this chunk that the player can do the first time they're exploring it. But then on top of that, we add the additional layer of optional side content and paths that the player can only get once they've unlocked later game abilities. And so basically, as the player progresses through the game, they unlock abilities. Now when they retraverse and come back to this very first area of the game, maybe they have an ability that lets them go to point number M and L and J, but only 3 levels later will they be able to come back and explore H, K, and N. And so we're always trying to create these spaces in such a way that the player they're teased with more, and that it unfolds itself more as the player basically gets stronger and grows their skill set and their move set. So when we're sort of creating these spaces, or at least my personal process, when I was sort of creating the levels, the individual scenes themselves, I would tend to start with something like a sketch, where I sort of lay out my high level intent, that I want the player to engage with a certain mechanic in a certain way. How do I want to explore those mechanics or the different interactives that I have at my disposal? What are the key features basically, and what are some individual sequences that on their own are cool and feel fun and float nicely? And then eventually, how can I connect those to other scenes and add in all of the extra layers that I mentioned and extra secrets and paths and things? But so I'll create these sketches. I'll have sort of like an array of different ideas that I think work really well. And then I'll just go into the blockout, where basically, usually it's called gray boxing, but ours were sort of black solids. So I guess it's black boxing, where we sort of, block out the environment with these collider, solids. And we add these red solids for things like damage zones and stuff. We place our various different gameplay elements that enable us to play and test the spaces. And this is basically where I lived for many years, in this sort of blocky world where I'm just building out the space, trying things out, seeing what works, what doesn't. And then eventually, once we have something in place that feels good, we've play tested and everything else, people seem to appreciate it, then we would go in and have the artists work their magic and turn it into something that I can't even believe it looks that good. And so that's sort of like, the high level like process that we would take, or that I took personally when building these spaces. And this slide kind of ties back to my previous slide where I was talking about having those additional sort of layers that unfold as you sort of come back to an environment. So as an example of creating a layered space, in the top left here, you have these 2 different distinct plants. When the player first comes through this level, they can't actually interact with these. They don't have the necessary abilities to do so. So all they can do is go right and then eventually go left to sort of backtrack and climb back and continue the story. But both times they're teased with these gameplay elements, and they're probably curious and wondering what they're for, what they can actually do. And then only once the player has discovered 2 unique abilities in 2 distinct locations, when they come back to this level in their retraversal or exploration, collecting things, or just going, from one part of the world to another, they will be teased with these again. And now that they can interact with them, there's an extra layer to this space, to this level that was not accessible to the player before, that allows them to get optional content, optional collectibles, and things like this. So these layered spaces I'm referring to, they're not necessarily the same as the gates. Whereas obviously ability gating, it is a form of gating because it's gating you from content. It's gating you from getting to a certain collectible, but it's not gating you from progressing further in the main progression of the world. It's sort of just like, it's an extra layer on top of a space that the player needs certain abilities to be able to get to. And so another example of this layered space that actually is the opposite of this, where we're adding a layer higher up that the player needs abilities to be able to reach. We also had examples of creating a layered space where the player has to go down. So this is some sort of diggable surface, diggable terrain that the player needs a specific ability to be able to enter. So the first time they're exploring this level, they might not have that ability, and all they can do is sort of engage with this surface level and fight the monsters and get the collectibles and things. But once they have this dig ability to enter the sand, enter the snow, it completely recontextualizes the space, because they see this thing that was just ground before, but now they see an opportunity for traversal and exploration. And so as you can see, like the layering of the spaces in these very clear examples, it is literally creating an upper layer or a lower layer that's sort of blocked off by certain abilities. But these aren't the only kind of examples of layering spaces. There are just little alcoves and little breakable walls and things like this that are just in plain sight, and the player just can't open until they get a specific key or ability or whatever, and that's fine. But the considerations that go into making these layered spaces are quite important for making a Metroidvania that's successful. And then one other example that's almost the most intricate example of a layered space in the game is the Wellspring Glades. And this is that hub that I mentioned much earlier in the presentation that the player can return to during the experience to sort of invest in it, help it grow. The more they come back as they unlock new abilities, the more collectibles and secrets they can discover that are gated off by those various moves. Because we wanted to make sure that if the player is going to be coming back to this place, probably after every new area they've explored, to upgrade and talk to the NPCs and spend their currency and collectibles and things, we wanted to reward the player each time with something new to find and discover along the way. But then on top of that, so creating the layered spaces for the ability gating, we also created layers based on the actual progression of the environment itself. As the player would invest in the hub, they would construct new bridges and ways to traverse and climb and get higher into the trees or access areas that were inaccessible previously. And also they would bring seeds back that would grow plants like these two here that suddenly would give access to a higher layer of the space that wasn't accessible before. And so we had to create this relatively small space when you look at the total size of the world, but that had so much intricacy and layering to it so that the player always feels like each time they come back, whether it's 10 or 15 times throughout the experience, there's always an extra thing for the player to discover that they couldn't access before. So when I mention things like ability gating, that obviously comes with like the player discovering, unlocking new abilities, and then getting new abilities means teaching the player those new abilities. And in a game like this, we found that the best way of teaching that tends to be what I call like the in and out tutorialization process. So in this case, for example, the player traverses through this part of a dungeon and gets to point number 2, which is a locked door. They're teased with a blue flower that they've seen in the game before. They still can't interact with it. The door is closed. They can't exit. So all they can do is continue on forward to the left. As they continue to the left, they cross this spiky barrier and they're unable to go back. At this point, they're locked in. They cannot go back to where they came from. They can't explore alternate paths. They have no choice but to go forward because these spikes are blocking their way. The player then very shortly uncovers the grapple ability, which gives them the ability to interact with blue sort of mossy surfaces or blue plants. And what this does is gives them the tool necessary to then go back out of this little section they entered using that new ability. So they're able to interact with these sort of blue flowers, and they're able to interact with this blue moss that was teased before, that before they could only jump to it if they had something that launched them there, but now they can literally pull themselves to it using their new ability that then makes retraversing this space trivial, whereas before it was impossible. And then when they finally get back to the door and that blue flower, they see the lever that opens the door and they can see through the UI that they're able to interact with this when they weren't able to before. And all of this leads to the player unlocking the door and exiting the scene. And so this sort of in and out principle is what we would use in general whenever we would want to be teaching, introducing and teaching a new power to the player pretty much in the game world. Another consideration that came into play a lot when we're building our levels is having things like shortcuts and surprising connections. It's the same principle. I'm sure people are plenty familiar with games like Dark Souls and things like that. It's a very similar principle where the player is exploring an environment and then they find a door or an elevator or a connection or a breakable wall. And all of a sudden they realize that on the other side of that connection is an area that they explored 5 hours earlier in the game experience. And that always feels extremely rewarding. It feels very satisfying. And it also facilitates retraversal and flow in those environments. But also that's like on a world level, connecting different areas, like entire areas through these connections. But even on like within an area itself and in the levels, it's important to create shortcuts. So that way the player, as they've explored the environment, they're paving the way to allow them to retraverse and re-explore the environment in a much faster, more fluid way, because they've already proven themselves. They've already proven that they're able to do the level the original way in the golden path. So why not let them now create a shortcut for themselves that lets them skip some content that they've already played in their pursuit of trying to go from one point of the world or the level to another. So that's something that we try to lean on as much as possible, especially when we realize that retraversing through a certain section of the game would be otherwise extremely tedious, where the main path was fun and it was a cool puzzle or a cool challenge, but going back and forth through it 15 times just wasn't very pleasant. So then we would lean on things like these shortcuts to alleviate some of that. Okay, so with all of these considerations in mind, right? We've built the world, we've organized, we built the levels themselves, we've puzzle pieced them together to create the world itself, right? That's interconnected. It's got shortcuts. We're teaching the player their new abilities. We're introducing mechanics. The story flows from start to finish. We've got everything put together, right? That comes together in the final months of the game. Only then can we really truly playtest the game as a whole and see if it's working and where its shortcomings are, and then decide how we want to improve on that. We would test individual parts of the world, or maybe just the first act of the game that we had connected, or individual areas. But all of those things are sort of in a vacuum when you consider the overall experience of the game, and knowing that eventually you're going to get to this other late game level and get this ability and stuff. It's all important for that overall impression that you get from the game experience. And so that's why we have to play test near the end here and really see what we can do to improve. So I'm just going to go through a couple examples of the kinds of considerations we had to make, kind of decisions that we made while we were working on the environments, and as we were watching the play tests and things like this. So this is an example that I remember because I worked on it directly from the water mill, the environment, the wellspring, where basically it was one of the earliest environments that was designed in the game. It was being worked on probably before I even joined the studio, and I was on the project for about 4 years. So it was worked on for a long time. It passed through a lot of different hands in the design team. And basically, at the end of the day, when we had it ready for this final playtesting, session, before we decided on what were the big changes we had to make for the final months or so, we realized that we had a few of these sort of spinning wheels in the level, but there were about 2 or 3 of them in this giant dungeon, and it felt really strange. It felt like it was an afterthought or an accident or leftovers. It didn't feel like it was part of the theme of the environment or that it was properly explored. And so when we discussed this, we realized that the dungeon itself felt a bit static and bland in a number of ways, and it needed something to spice it up and give it a little bit more of an identity. And the fact that these gameplay elements were so underutilized, it felt like a perfect opportunity to inject more of a gameplay identity and some memorable gameplay moments into this environment that needed it, while also making these wheels that were in the environment feel less out of place. And so what we ended up doing was committing to completely redesigning the initial first 2 areas or scenes, let's say, of the dungeon, to put the entire focus on introducing these spinning wheels as a concept, and in a safe environment where the player has multiple optional things to collect by proving and exploring this mechanic in different ways. And that plus a couple other utilizations of this element later on in the environment really helped to sort of tie it together and make it feel like a more consistent sort of escalation of mechanics and give more of an identity to the environment. So this is a process that happened here, but also in a number of different areas in the game where we identified similar cases. And it was very important, I think, for making sure that these areas worked on the whole pretty much when you're playing the full experience. Another very common thing that we did during this iteration process was a spike reduction pass, where basically, in level design, especially when you're working in gray box, at least in my experience, it can become very easy to get trigger happy with the spikes, because we're so focused on challenge, we're so focused on, precise platforming and really tight metrics that we like to sometimes, unfortunately, coat everything that we don't want you to touch with spikes and force you to really precisely only touch these very tiny little spaces in the environment while you're traversing. But that tends to actually be, that tends not to be that fun for many of the people that we tested it with. Some people love that kind of precise challenge, but we realized that ultimately people liked a lot more, comfortable leeway in the metrics and spacing. And then it got even worse when we started to do the art and the set dressing on the environments, because when we would build these out, they would tend to be very, very thin, sort of like spiky, thin red surfaces. So they were very the metrics were very different than when you have to address them with these thick spike graphics that are actually maybe 3 or 4 times wider, thicker than the original thing was when we designed the level. And sometimes we wouldn't consider that difference. And so a space that was about this, where the player could kind of, tightly get through, suddenly became this once it had the set dressing, and it felt even more comfortable. And so all of these things, well, these considerations plus one final consideration, which is that we're making a beautiful artistic game and coding all of this beautiful artwork with these very intrusive, spiky elements that make it feel very gamey, ultimately kind of detract from that magical, whimsical, beautiful space that we're trying to craft. And so a lot of these considerations in mind, we were, consistently and slowly chipping away at the spikes during this process. And sometimes there were fights between different parts of the different departments on the team, because, we were saying, look, we really find these spikes important for the challenge, but art was saying, you know what, but it really detracts from this. And sometimes we'd always have to find that middle ground, where both parties are happy. And at the end of the day, I think that we made the right choices in facilitating the flow in a lot of these spaces, because people tend to do what we want them to do, even if the spaces are not completely coated in spikes. And they're having more fun doing so. And ultimately seeing people getting completely frustrated on the overly spiky environments, it was enough for me personally to say, yeah, we have to pull the trigger on getting rid of a lot of these spikes because people are not attaching to the game the way that we wanted them to, unfortunately. Another thing that we noticed during this iteration phase was we had built a lot of content on the golden path. We're building an environment in isolation sometimes, like we're building an area, one level designer is building it in a sort of vacuum, and then eventually we go and we connect it to the world and then make changes and things for that. But a lot of the times that means that we're making the golden path and we have some side content, but we're trying to put all of our cool ideas in the main path that the player has to traverse. And so in this example, in the watermill environment, the player had to they come out this door at number 1, and then they have to go to number 2, which is another door. But to get there, they have to go all the way around here and do this sort of challenge section to then drop down and get to point number 2. And you can argue that that's more interesting design-wise, but what we noticed was that in the whole, when they played this entire dungeon, the experience, it was extremely long for people. They were feeling quite tired. They were like, oh, you know what, it's too much. And then when they get to this point, which is near the final third or so of the final quarter of the environment, they're sort of like, oh my God, there's this whole new section I have to do. And they felt like pacing-wise, they were pretty much ready to wrap up the experience. And so what we ended up doing after those play tests was we just streamlined it and made the golden path simply to go from 1 straight to 2. And we turned this into an optional branch that the player can explore if they choose to do so. But obviously, in doing that, we needed to make sure that we placed a few collectibles to make sure that the player felt like it was rewarding to actually go out of the main path like that. And in the end, it was a positive change. And we saw that the reception of the overall dungeon was much more positive, partially as a result to that, but other changes as well. And again, this is the kind of thing that we considered and did quite extensively in certain areas of the game to make it feel as fun to play as possible. One final thing that I found quite important that we did in this iteration pass, that seems a bit crazy in hindsight, but it really was necessary and important, I feel, is we had some areas that we were designing that ultimately in the meta pacing of the entire game experience. So considering the story flow, considering you just did a very challenging, spiky death trap environment, and now you're going on to the next level, and it's another dangerous, scary spike trap environment, it felt like the overall pacing was always dialed up to 11, and there wasn't room to breathe and soak in the atmosphere and the lore and the environment and the story. And so we identified a couple of these places in the final months and said, look, this dungeon at the end of the desert, which is already a challenging environment, doesn't need to be a dungeon. It has a challenging escape at the end. Why don't we transform what is normally supposed to be this gameplay heavy challenge section before the escape into a lore moment where the player simply walks and explores and uncovers information about the backstory of the world that they've been playing in for all this time. And that actually was a very positive change for pacing, because the player explores the environment before this dungeon or before this temple. They enter the temple, they get this breathing room. Pacing wise, they get to appreciate the story and something else and take a breather. And then just as they get to the bottom and they collect the object they came for, they get surprised by an escape. And now the challenge ramps up again. And so it's almost like putting it on a graph of intensity and keeping that stuff in mind. And then the final example here on the right, which is another key example of this, is we had this environment called the Silent Woods, where it was very story driven. In reality, it was meant to be this very atmospheric, exploratory place, but the original level design was crammed full of spikes explosives, challenging metrics. The way that you controlled the characters didn't feel very good and fun. We made the wrong calls on these things. We realized it very late, and we made the call to basically flip the table and redesign the space with barely any spikes in danger, with a heavy focus on storytelling. We invested in some more vignettes and some more introduction to our main antagonist and some more endearing moments and playfulness with our main characters to really emphasize and hit hard on the emotional beats that we wanted to get from that environment. And also, it came directly after a very dangerous, very challenging escape and dungeon. And so once again, overall pacing-wise, on the meta scale, on the meta pacing of the game, it felt very refreshing and very rewarding to get this kind of, breathing room pacing break, while also putting such a strong emphasis on the exploration and on the storytelling and the characters and world building, pretty much. So all in all, this playtesting and iteration process really was a net positive, obviously, for the final game. And yeah, we did do some very heavy renovation in a certain number of areas. And there's numerous that I didn't have time to put into this talk. But really, this was where the magic happened, I think. Once we finally had everything put together, that's where we could start to make the real calls and make the overall experience shape up into what it ended up becoming when we finally released it. So, in conclusion, I don't really have a sort of, here's a bullet point list of 10 things you should consider when you're designing the world for a Metroidvania game or something. I ultimately just want to say that this was just me. When I joined Moon Studios, I had never worked on a Metroidvania game before. I came from working on very self-contained, one-off platforming levels, similar to the ones I mentioned earlier in the talk on Rayman, pretty much. And so coming in and using what I learned on level designing in this kind of context was a very interesting challenge. That everything that I learned in the process that helped us get to what we have in the final game, just a handful of those things that I've learned, I've tried to sort of give you some insight into in this talk. And so hopefully you've taken something away that was valuable for your future projects. And if not, hopefully you at least enjoyed, a peek behind the curtain on how we created Ori and the Will of the Wisps. So thank you, and I appreciate you being here.
All right, thank you, Chris. And now we still have time for a couple of questions. So the first one is, can level designer beat his style or not?
Can a level designer, beat his style?
Beat his style or not? I think...
Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I don't really understand exactly the question, though.
Maybe I think it means, can a level designer make his own professional level, skills level even better than he is at the moment? Maybe in some case like this.
So is it possible to grow and become an even better level designer or something like that? I mean, always, right? That actually ties into exactly the conclusion I just gave, where I felt like working on Rayman for 5 years, pretty much, that I had gained a really decent skill level in especially 2D platforming level design. But when I jumped in at Moon Studios working on Ori, it was a very different beast entirely. And it kind of flipped a lot of the rules that I had sort of internalized when designing levels upside down and made me rethink the way that I design spaces. And now I know that if I'm designing one type of game or another, I need to approach the level design in a very different fashion. But I also learned that there are certain techniques and certain principles that carry over independent of the genre that you're making. And so obviously you can always improve and grow as a level designer. I think what it comes down to is challenging yourself by jumping into new projects where maybe you feel a little bit less comfortable, and adapting and really taking on the challenge of trying to learn and grow and not falling too hard on, no, I do things this way. I think this is good, and this is the only way that I'm ever going to do it, right? It's just about being open-minded to that growth potential that you have.
And the next question from the same participant, how to come up with the cool navigation around the world so that player understands what they want at a particular moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It basically, it's about, it's a lot of it's about playtesting your environments, right? It's about you build your space, you're building your individual level, and you're connecting it to the next piece and stuff. And then it's about playtesting it and paying attention to what is the player presented with at any given screen, pretty much. If I walk, like when I'm on the starting screen, I see the path continuing to the left or the right outside of the camera view, pretty much. So all I know is I can go there or there. And if I go to the right and I see that there's a wall and there's a little shiny on top of it, well, I'm going to try to get up that wall. Right? Even if I don't know if I can, I'm going to jump to the wall and I'm going to press buttons and I'm going to try things and see if I can do it. And then as you progress further, you see a blocker, a gate or something, and then you see a path going down. And so again, it's about like, how do you show the player opportunities, and how do you can make sure that the context is clear, that certain opportunities are for the future and that they don't get too hung up on them right now. And for example, one example that I think where we failed and then kind of fixed it near the end was in the Silent Woods example I mentioned, where it was very game focused and then we turned it into more of a story environment. One of the issues that we had in that environment was actually you enter into this new gameplay style. You're in like tandem with the owl that you're riding basically, and you have very limited skill set compared to what you had before. You can't do all the abilities that you had because it's a sort of story driven sequence. But unfortunately, when the level was designed originally, the level designers placed a lot of gameplay elements that you could only interact with when you weren't on top of the owl, right? And so unfortunately, what it did was it made players get confused because they were like, wait, I know how to interact with this thing. I've seen it before. Why can't I do it? And it added frustration because it's like, I want to go up there. I know that I can, but it's not letting me, right? And so what we ended up doing when we reworked the environment was stripping away all of those elements that were teasing you of all the abilities you used to have, but that you don't have yet like anymore, because we realized it was having a negative impact and it was confusing the player with regards to the flow and where they needed to go, right? So it's about this combination of teasing when it's appropriate, but always making sure that the player has a couple of clear like options and places they can go or things to do on screen that then keeps them moving forward pretty much, if that makes sense.
All right, the next one is from Mikhailo. What was the hardest part of the game to make?
That's a good question. The hardest, it's hard to say. Like I haven't really like quantified it and made a tier list or something, but definitely one of the hardest, and it doesn't relate to this talk per se, was probably the bosses. That's also because I personally worked on the bosses. And so I know that it was like a very challenging experience. And I can elaborate just a little bit on why I say that. Because what we want, like the very first game did not have bosses in it. It had escape sequences where the player runs away from a dangerous wall or something like that. Those were like the stand-ins for bosses in a platforming game like this. But when I joined the project, it was already clear that, the team wanted to have bosses, like proper combat and proper bosses in the game. And that meant creating a whole new combat system, but then also creating these giant, larger than life, three-dimensional bosses, like a really fat toad that expands, in the front and in the back in a flat world pretty much, and making that feel good in two-dimensional game space, and how do we present it in a way that it's clear where it's going to collide with the player? How do we create patterns that are fun and clear and understandable, but also don't feel robotic? Because we wanted the enemies and the bosses to feel as organic and alive as the environments in the world felt, and not feel like a gamey pattern robot, like maybe like a Mega Man boss or something might feel. We didn't want that as much as possible. And so it was really like trying to combine all of these ambitious intentions and still make a fun, fair, platforming combat boss fight pretty much. So that was definitely something that we spent a lot of time iterating on and tried a bunch of different directions before we finally settled on the direction that we had for the released game.
Okay, nice. Mohammed is asking, hello, Mr. Chris. Thank you for this great presentation. My question is how to know when you must give on a certain idea or a design? Okay,
so if I understand correctly, I'm guessing it's how do you know when to let go of an idea like that? Okay, yeah, that is definitely one of the hardest things to learn, especially in your first, well, at least like in my experience, right? I don't know how much experience you have, but in my experience, it was one of the hardest things to learn early on when I was getting started as a designer, because you have this feeling that every idea that you have is genius. You think everything is going to be amazing, and it's just everybody else that doesn't understand it, or it's the other people in the team that have to do more work to prove it out, and everything else. But in your head that it works and it's going to work. And I think it's not a matter of how do you do it. It's a matter of learning to do it in general. You know what I mean? Because I've gotten to a place where I have certain ideas that I will fight and push for when I feel very confident about it. But at the end of the day, when it's not working, it's not working. And probably the tip for really identifying when to let go, it's about identifying what the bare minimum representation or execution of that idea is to be able to prove whether or not it's worth doing. Right. And so it's about understanding that you should be able to know that this idea is working or can or will work, and have other people feel confident about that before it's at 100%, polish and completion, pretty much. And it's about identifying where to focus those attentions. So it's like, do you really need somebody making all the effects for this specific ability? Is that really important? Or is it about the animation and the feel, right? Or in terms of the level design, do I really need to have the fully functioning gameplay element, or can I fake it with like a trigger and an animation or something, but it gives off the impression that I need it to see if the team appreciates it or not, right? And so it's just about being able to understand, like, is the idea not working because of the idea itself, or is it not working because it's buggy or unfinished or unrefined? And sometimes the line is a bit blurry, but I've personally enjoyed my job a lot more the more easily I've accepted that my first ideas are usually the worst, and it's always about getting past that first idea and finding the next one and the next one that's ultimately going to be better, right? And then embracing it. So, yeah.
All right. So finally, I would like to read a few feedbacks from our listeners. So the first one from Ivan. Absolutely amazing game, one of my all-time favorites. Incredibly well designed, with so many great and interesting ideas, tricks, and decisions. Thanks a lot for interesting speech and magnificent game. And the next one from Victoria. This is really smart trick with the mills and tree that helps immersing into the game. So cool.
Cool.
Okay, that's really cool. Thank you, Chris.